London, a beautiful poem, but also very sad and bleak vision of London, by William Blake. So let's have a look. London by William Blake. I wandered through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now, most students I know would probably panic if they see such a poem, especially in an exam. Now, poems are kind of popular in exams, especially oral exams, in advanced courses. So I'd like to show you how to deal with such a poem. This is an old poem, so language is difficult, so please make sure that you understand all of the annotations before you start. Yeah, I've said there are 10 easy steps. Let's have a look at them. Yeah, one after another. So, interpreting poetry in 10 steps. The first one is to read it aloud. Check. The second is to say it in your own words. Number 3, consider what the poem might be about. Number 4, examine who is speaking and how that person is speaking. Describe the form of the poem. Examine the language and imagery. Add a bit of context to your interpretation. Take a look at the big picture at the end, once you've analyzed everything, examined everything. And then, of course, reread it and enjoy your findings. Finally, think about what the poem might mean to you personally. Now, say it on your own words. What does this actually mean? You simply write down what you think the line means. Now, sometimes, or often in poetry, lines are ambiguous. This means that they can mean several things at once. In that case, you'd have to write down several possibilities. Now, I've tried to be as clear as possible to make it as simple as possible. A speaker wanders through the streets of London. And he also wanders near the straightened Thames. So the River Thames has somehow been straightened. Yeah, it used to flow this way and that way, but now it's been, well, straightened. He sees a lot of feeble, that is weak, and sad faces. He hears men and scared babies cry. He hears other people's voices and commands or laws telling people what to do and especially what not to do. Yeah. And he hears the sound of the rattling of mental prison chains, the mind-forged manacles that he's talking about here, in these voices. There's a crying chimney sweeper, and this chimney sweeper shocks the churchgoers, yeah, while the churches are turning black. Now, a chimney sweeper, that's a chimney sweeper, okay? Yeah. There's also a soldier, a hapless soldier, meaning an unlucky or unhappy soldier, and he is sighing, and his sigh is like blood on a palace wall. At night, the speaker mostly hears the curses, yeah, of young prostitutes, and these curses make babies cry heavily. Yeah. This curse or these curses also kill people right after their marriages with diseases. You know? So that's my brief description of what the poem literally says. And this is at the same time step 2. Say it in your own words. No? Now, the third step is to consider what the poem might be about. I've actually done this, and I've just taken the poem, and I've added a little bubble here, thought bubble, yeah. First thoughts. So what are my first thoughts, my first impressions? Yeah. Well, I think it's obviously a poem about London. Why? Because the title. Because of the title. There's a lot of misery in the poem. Yeah. So people cry. There are tears. They are afraid. Yeah, and so on and so forth. This seems to have to do with the living conditions of the people. My assumption, that's already a bit of context, is that this has to do with the industrialization, with industrial life. Yeah. Now these are my first thoughts, and it makes sense to think a bit more about this and to see if we can find any ideas or concepts in the poem that are repeated or contrasted and that somehow relate to my first impression. Now I've also done that. So these ideas immediately lead me to a look at what's repeated again and again in the poem. Yeah, and there are two main things that come up again and again: the city and its people, and you might say the emotions that these people have. Yeah, so I've tried to highlight these things: the city in pink, the charted street, the charted Thames, the laws of the city, the ban, so to speak, the blackening churches, the palace walls, I forgot to highlight the palace walls properly, yeah, and the midnight streets, yeah. So these are elements of the city that are used to create an atmosphere here, but these are also contrasted with the people that live there. So the person, the speaker, him or herself, of course, yeah, and the people he or she meets, yeah, every man, every infant, the voices, the chimney sweeper, the soldier, the prostitute, more infants, babies, yeah, and married couples, yeah. So lots of people from all sections, from all swaths of life, you might say. And this is contrasted in the poem and repeated again and again. Now, I think that the poem, and this is my first thought on this, of course, and is interested in the impact that the city has on its people, the social and emotional impact. Of course, I'm trying to make things simple here. Yeah, I'm aiming for a simple interpretation. So my first hypothesis, we call this a hypothesis because it's my first assumption, my first idea of what the poem might be about, is that it is a criticism of the urban consequences of the industrialization in London. Now, what's the next step? This was step 3, consider what it might be about. Step 4 is examine who is speaking and how that person is speaking. I do this in my next section in blue. Now, the person that appears in this poem is a lyric persona. It's called a lyric persona because it's like a person. Yeah, it's not just a voice about whom we don't know anything. It's a person, and we learn a few things about that person. For instance, we learn that this person is wandering through the city of London. There's a personal pronoun here, I, and the speaker describes his or her experience while walking through London. Yeah, so the person is wandering through London. And of course the speaker describes lots of sensations, mainly the things the person hears and sees in London. Yeah, so I've highlighted these things here: the woe, so the sadness, because of losses, human loss, for instance. Yeah, the fear, the cries, the sigh. Yeah, so lots of things that the lyrical persona, the lyric persona hears and sees. Now, the lyric persona also seems to be quite sensitive to the suffering of these people. Yeah, he or she doesn't just ignore the other people. The feelings of these people make up really the core of the poem. So the speaker seems to be interested in how people feel, how the Londoners feel. So this is called subjectivity. Poems are subjective. I mean, most literary texts are subjective, but poems in particular deal with subjective experience. And this is reflected in the tone of the poem. I would think this is more of a somber tone, so very serious, maybe sad, yeah. And this is because the speaker is in a sad or depressed mood. Now you just have to look at all of these words here, yeah. Woe, fear, sigh, tears, and so on and so forth. Yeah, this suggests that this is not exactly a happy poem, you know, and not a happy voice either. Okay, so this is step 4. We've examined who is speaking and how that person is speaking. Now let's move on to the form of the poem. The form. I'll begin with what is often quite simple, I would think, the rhyme scheme. Yeah. So many poems, especially older ones, have rhyme schemes. Yeah. This poem has a fairly simple rhyme scheme: A B, C D, and so on and so forth. Street, flow, meet, woe, man, fear, ban, here, cry, appalls, sigh, walls, hear, curse, tear, hearse. Yeah. Yeah, you should be able to hear the rhyme. The only thing that's really distinctive here, I think, and peculiar, is that the words in the second stanza, fear and hear, actually don't just rhyme with each other, but also with the lines 13 and 15 in the final stanza. Yeah, and when lines rhyme, this usually shows that there has to be some connection. And of course, if we look at these lines, it's fairly obvious that, for instance, line 6 and line 15 talk about babies and infants, yeah, and how they feel, yeah. There's fear, and here there are tears. So you should, I mean, rhymes connect lines, yeah, and they also create an expectation, yeah, from one line to the next, yeah. So the speaker who the listener who gets used to or hears that rhyme scheme, yeah, will of course expect that this rhyme scheme is adhered to, that it's not broken. It isn't in this case, yeah. So that's the rhyme scheme. Let's move on to the next bit, yeah. This is more difficult, especially for German students of English, because when we analyze the rhythm of the poem, we have to look at the natural flow of the language. And this is something that is obviously easier for native speakers, although it doesn't mean that it has to be easy for native speaker. You know? Now there's a simple trick if you have difficulties with this. Yeah? Many famous poems, and this is also true of plays which contain rhythmic language, Shakespeare's plays, for instance. Yeah? You can often find famous passages from these plays or famous poems online, performed by famous actors on YouTube. So if you enter London and William Blake, you will, for instance, find a performance by Idris Elba. So he has, of course, thought about what a natural flow of language would be, and he is a professional. So you can simply listen to his poem and check, okay, which words, which syllables does he stress, and this will help you identify the rhythm. Now, what we need to look at is the sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables. Yeah. So the first line is this: I wander through each shouted street. Now, not each syllable has the same stress. To put it bluntly, I wander through each charted street. I wander through each charted street. And I've added a few annotations here. So wander has a stress, through has a stress, charted has a stress, and street has a stress. Yeah. Now, if I count these stresses, I can count up to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 stresses. These are the beats of the line. And this is the foot, so unstressed and stressed. Yeah. If an unstressed syllable is followed by a stressed syllable, we'll call this an iamb. Yeah. And the entire meter is called iambic tetrameter, because there are 4 different beats and the main foot is the iamb. Now sometimes, of course, poems break, there are breaks in the meter, there are irregularities. And this is extremely important because these irregularities create emphasis. The listeners hear these breaks. Yeah. For instance, this line is very important. Yeah. And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Because the first syllable is stressed and not the second one, there is a strong emphasis on marks. And the same happens in this line, and in these 2 lines. The rest of the poem is fairly regular. We'll look at what this means later, but of course you have to look at these lines in particular. So what is actually emphasized here? In this case, visual signs of people suffering, the marks of weakness. The same here, the blackening church, yeah, is a visible sign that something is not going well in London, yeah. And every church emphasizes, of course, that this is not just a small problem, but a big problem in London. And how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. The how is emphasized here with this stress, with this break in the meter. And this again emphasizes, of course, the extent of the suffering, how much people suffer. Yeah, so that's basically the rhythm. Let's have another look at, in this case, the language and imagery in the poem. Now, as you can see, my sheet is getting fuller and fuller. But I think that's a good way to approach a poem and to work with the poem, to go step by step and to add more details. Now what I've done in this case is I've looked at some rhetorical devices here in the poem. Yeah. Now in order to do that, you need of course a list of rhetorical devices, and you should know them by heart. You should memorize them in order to be able to identify them quickly and then explain them. Let's go through this quickly. Yeah, the speaker is wandering through the streets of London, and he or she is meeting people, more and more people. Every face, faces, faces, faces. Now, of course, he's not meeting faces; he's meeting people. So the face is a symbol for the person here. We call this a synecdoche. Yeah? This kind of device. Well, what does this suggest? I mean, first of all, the speaker is looking at the person's faces, not so much the rest of their outward appearance. And their faces, they're not people, there aren't any names, there's, well, no other information about them really. So this suggests that there are many faces around. He seems to be surrounded by masses of people there. So the synecdoche really suggests that London is peopled by lots of people suffering, living in misery, and so on and so forth. Of course, this also leads us to a context of the poem, because during the time of industrialization, many people moved into the cities, and this caused lots of problems and made the living conditions much worse. Now, the speaker also achieves this effect through repetition. Now, this is very easy to spot, I would think. Yeah. So several expressions are repeated here: the charted street and the charted Thames. Yeah, and of course the word every and mark. Mark in every face, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Yeah. And the word every is repeated again and again and again in the poem. Again, I think this suggests that there are masses of people, and because many people live together and work together in such small cramped space, yeah, this causes lots of problems. Yeah, he sees so many people as he's walking through London, all of them are suffering. This is what is suggested through synecdoche and repetition, as well as anaphora. Now, anaphora is when sentences, or actually clauses, I should say, begin with the same words. So in every, in every, and in every. And of course, this again puts very strong emphasis. It really underlines the idea of many people being around and many people suffering because there are too many people and the living conditions are bad. Yeah, he also uses a metaphor in line 8. Yeah, the mind-forged manacles. Now, manacles are basically chains used in prisons. Yeah, so what the speaker is doing here, he's comparing life in London to a prison, or life in a prison. People are imprisoned, not literally, but in their minds. Yeah, what's imprisoning people? Of course, the experience that they live in is like being in a prison. London is like a prison. And of course the ban that is mentioned here, so these laws that tell people what to do or not to do, together with the suffering, gives people the impression that they cannot get out, that there's not much freedom, not much liberty maybe, not much choice in what they want to do. But I would think that mind-forged manacles, especially because they're mind-forged, so they were made by the mind, is that people are probably not conscious of these chains that hold them or bind them to their miserable lives. Now, the next one is called a synesthesia. In line 11 and 12, the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Now, this device combines two different forms of sensual impression. Yeah, a sigh is something that we hear with our ears, whereas the blood is something that we see on the wall. Yeah, and both are combined here. Yeah, we see something that we would normally hear. Yeah, and this is a synesthesia. Yeah, I would think that it highlights or that it raises awareness, or actually I should say that it draws attention to these lines. Yeah, because they may seem a bit confusing at first. Yeah, so maybe it makes the reader or listener stop and think about it. What does this actually mean? Yeah, so the soldier is not suffering emotionally or mentally as he's sighing, but soldiers are also dying, and I think this is what this means. Yeah, and the synesthesia makes readers stop here and think, look, what does this actually mean? Yeah. And yes, so it means that the suffering is not just psychological, but also physical. There's violence in London. Finally, I'd like to mention the hyperbole here at the end. Yeah, the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. Now, to blast something is to make something explode, so there's an explosion of tears. This is obviously an exaggeration. Hyperbole is another word for exaggeration, you might say. And yeah, again, this of course emphasizes how much people suffer. Yeah. So when you identify rhetorical devices in a poem or in a different kind of text. It's always important not just to find it and to find the exact and correct technical term, but also to explain what they mean. And I think I've tried to show you how this can be done. Now, so this is the rhetoric or the rhetorical aspect of the text. Now let's move on and to the next bit, add a bit of context. Now this is something that I will do very quickly. I don't want to go into this very much here. Why not? Because this would be, the video is getting long enough, and if we want to talk about the industrialization in Britain and urbanization in the 19th century, that in itself would be enough material for another video. So suffice it to say here that I think industrialization and urbanization are the key contexts that we might look at if we wanted to. But I won't do this here because the video is getting too long otherwise. I want to finish quickly. What's left to do? We need to take a look at the big picture. We've analyzed the poem in a fair amount of detail, I would think. So we need to put things together. Of course, we cannot repeat everything, but we need to at least come back to a few issues. So our original, this is my overview, a bit like a mind map, you might say. Well, not a mind map, but a graphic overview on the key findings. It really goes back to my original idea, that the poem is somehow a criticism of the urban consequences of the industrialization. This was my original hypothesis, and now I'm coming back to it in order to check whether this was correct, or whether I have to change my hypothesis. And of course I have to change it. I usually have to. Now I would change my original interpretation slightly. So the poem, I would say that the poem makes us see with the eyes of a Londoner all the suffering caused by industrialization, mass urbanization and poverty. We look really through the eyes of one particular Londoner walking through the streets. This is this section again, lyric persona. We talked about the wandering speaker, his or her sensations and his or her sensitivity to the suffering. So the poem makes us watch all this and hear all this through the eyes and ears of that person. This is of course mainly done by Blake, by having chosen a specific subject matter. So the poem is structured really in the form of a contrast between the city and its people, and the relationship between the two, I think, can be characterized as an emotional relationship as well as a social relationship. The poem explores the impact that the city has on its people. To put it simply, the poem explores what a city can do to its people. And I think we've talked about this. Now, the rhythm emphasizes this, as we've seen. There are breaks in the iambic tetrameter, and these breaks draw attention to the extent of the suffering, the marks of weakness, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. These things are symbols of suffering that are emphasized by the rhythm because they stand out from the rest of the rhythm, because they are breaks in the rhythm. Now finally, tone and rhetoric. The tone itself, as we've said, is a very dark and sad tone. It creates a dark vision of London that is evoked here. Maybe the poem has also some potential for empathy, because we actually look through the eyes of a Londoner who is sensitive to all that is going on, to the way people feel and how they are suffering. So I think this is also done with the voice, obviously, of that speaker. Finally, the rhetoric has a lot of emphasis on the experience of life in masses, as we've seen, an emphasis on suffering and the prison-like character of life. And all of this contributes, you could say, to our central meaning. This is the central meaning of our interpretation of the poem. Yeah. This is basically it. There's only one thing left to do, actually two things. Yeah, reread it and enjoy our findings. I won't do this now, but I would encourage you to do that in your own interpretations. Yeah, because a poem is like a puzzle, and that's wonderful. So there's such wonderful and beautiful language, especially in this poem, in this dark and bleak poem. Yeah. And only by rereading it can we really appreciate what the author has done in creating this wonderful piece of art. Finally, and think this is the most important step of all, think about what the poem might mean to you personally. Yeah. I mean, this is an old poem, but I think it still has things to tell us. For me personally, when I think of Blake, I think of sweatshops in India, in Pakistan, where people work and live under conditions which are exactly these kinds of conditions that Blake describes here, that Blake criticizes here. And if we go to H&M, C&A, and I don't know, if we buy clothes online, yeah, we of course we contribute in some ways to these problems. Yeah. And this is, I think, what the poem can even tell us today. And this is my own personal take on the poem, but maybe you have a different take on it. If so, please feel free to tell us about it in the comment section. For now, thank you very much, and thanks to our little friend William Shakespeare, who suggested the poem London by William Blake to us. Half an hour. I think that's more than enough. I wish you all the best, and to your loved ones, take care and bye-bye.